The next scripture is found on page 17 in the Pew Bible. It's from Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 1. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy and the angel of God calling to Hagar from heaven, and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You've heard me talk before about my experience as a chaplain intern at Wake Med this summer before my last year of seminary. In the way the summer program worked, I went in 5 days a week, working 8 to 4:30, I believe it was. But then throughout the summer, we would take turns on either 12-hour day shifts or 12-hour night shifts when we were on call. And in one of my early night shift experiences, I got a call to go to the room of a couple who had just lost their child. And I was thinking as I went, what am I going to say to these people to help them feel God's presence? And I had no idea. So I just put it in God's hands and said, "Okay, God, you be the mouthpiece." And I went in. And I sat and talked with a couple. They were both, I think, in their 30s. They talked about how they had saved money, working to put money aside over some period of time before they attempted to have their first child. And my reaction after hearing this was, this is just so wrong. I mean, it's always wrong when a child dies. And I don't remember how far along the woman was. I think it was fairly close to 40 weeks when the baby died. But as I sat and talked, and actually I listened, they began to talk about their faith and how they knew that God was present in the midst of that. and how their faith was strengthened. And so as I left that evening, I realized that I was not there for them, that they knew God was present, and they were able to share that with me. They witnessed to me about God's presence in their lives. We all struggle to feel God's presence at times. We question how God could let this, whatever the situation is, happen, and we may even conclude that God must be absent. Doubt is ever present, and that's okay. God can handle our doubts, and God is present whether we feel God's presence or not. Today's passage is not an easy story. Actually, none of the lectionary passages today were easy stories. But the Genesis reading begins in verse 8 with Abraham throwing a feast on the day his son Isaac is weaned. In the Bible, weaning a child, as one source describes, refers to the physical transition of stopping breastfeeding and shifting to solid food. In ancient Israel, this was a multi-year process, often lasting until age 2 or 3 or beyond. Culturally, it was a major survival milestone that was celebrated with feasts, as it marked the child passing the fragile infant stage when so many children died. But Sarah gets upset. The son of Hagar, the Egyptian, playing with her son Isaac, the text says, which is curious because Isaac is not mentioned in the Hebrew text. And the word translated as playing is the same word mentioned in verse 6 before today's passage and previously throughout chapter 21. Elsewhere, the word is translated as laugh or laughter. So we don't really know what Ishmael was doing that set Sarah off, and it doesn't really matter. In the first 7 verses before today's passage, God does what God said would happen, and Sarah conceives and gives birth to Isaac in both Sarah and Abraham's old age. Abraham circumcises Isaac as God commands, and then in verse 6, Sarah says, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Isaac's name means laughter, and commentators suggest that Sarah is upset because in laughing, Ishmael is Isaacing. In other words, trying to act like Isaac. I think Sarah is just looking for an excuse to get rid of Ishmael and his mother Hagar, now that Isaac has been weaned. Even though it was her idea for Hagar to become pregnant by Abraham in the first place. So Sarah pitches her little fit, and then Abraham responds. The passage says that the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. Well, duh. The word translated here as distressing and distressed when God speaks comes from the word meaning evil. Throwing Hagar and Abraham's first son out into the wilderness is evil. But when God tells Abraham to do what Sarah says, Abraham, caught between a rock and a hard place, gets up early in the morning, gives Hagar and their son bread and water, and sends them away. And as far as we know, Abraham never sees his eldest son again. We don't know why God seems to condone this. Yes, God assures Abraham that God will make a nation of Ishmael as well as Isaac, so he's going to be okay. But still. and things get bad for Hagar and her son. After wandering about in the wilderness of Beersheba, they run out of water, and the bread was probably gone too. The situation is helpless. Hagar can't bear to watch her son die, so she goes some distance away from him. Then she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. The angel asked, "What's wrong?" but obviously knows, because the question is followed by the reassurance that she doesn't need to be afraid, that God will make a great nation of Ishmael. Then God opens her eyes to see, and Hagar gives her son a drink. The story concludes. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lives in the wilderness, becomes an expert archer, which helps him survive, and he marries a woman Hagar brings home from Egypt. As you know, this past Friday was Juneteenth, the holiday celebrated annually on June 19th to commemorate the emancipation of enslaved Black Americans. It marks the day in 1865 when Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced that the Civil War had ended and all enslaved people were free. The name Juneteenth comes from combining June and 19th. Although the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, it took over 2.5 years for the news and federal authority to reach Texas, the most remote of the former Confederate states. Texas became the first state to formally recognize the holiday in 1980, but it wasn't until June 17, 2021, that it was officially recognized and signed into law as a federal holiday. Juneteenth and Emancipation Day celebrations often focus on education, resilience, and African American culture. As I've been thinking about the sermon this week, I've thought about names. Which names are said, and which ones are never mentioned? And why is that? In today's text, Ishmael is never mentioned by name, only referred to as the son of Hagar, or the child, or the boy. And we don't know why sometimes he's called a child and sometimes a boy. Sarah never says Hagar's name, but the angel of God does. In the previous story of Hagar in the wilderness that occurred in chapter 16, when Hagar is pregnant and has run away after Sarah has dealt with her harshly, the angel of the Lord also calls Hagar by name when asking her what's up. And I have to say, I really wonder about what would be considered dealing with her harshly after the previous experience of forcing Hagar to produce a child with Abraham. But the angel of the Lord, after telling Hagar to return to your mistress and submit to her, another problematic phrase, the angel of the Lord also says to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And then says, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. Ishmael means God hears. Then Hagar names the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi, meaning the God who sees. For she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? And then there's Hagar's name itself. Her name could be a play on the Hebrew Hagar, meaning the stranger or sojourner. The combination of the two stories makes me wonder if God was, in fact, looking out for Hagar and Ishmael both times, telling her to return instead of trying to survive and give birth alone in the desert, and then later, perhaps being sent away was to protect Hagar and Ishmael from Sarah's maybe escalating behavior toward Abraham's eldest son. We just don't know. One of the songs at yesterday's Juneteenth celebration that I attended implored us to say their names and mentioned by name several of the people impacted by violence in recent years. The singer invited the audience to lift up names of their loved ones who had died as a result of violence. The sound of names lifted up lasted for several minutes. Say Their Names is a rallying cry used to demand justice and bring attention to victims of systemic racism, police brutality, or racial injustice. The phrase urges the public to remember, honor, and speak aloud the stories of individuals who have died, ensuring they are not forgotten. It originated from the Say Her Name campaign launched in 2015 by the African American Policy Forum to ensure that Black women and girls, who are often invisible in the media, receive the same community concern and outcry as male victims, as one source describes. After people die, we often feel uncomfortable mentioning their names to their friends and family. We don't want to upset them. But in reality, it has the opposite effect. When we stop saying these names, those grieving think we have forgotten them. Instead, we need to continue to say the names of those who have died, whether from violence or not. Whenever I go to a funeral, I'm often inspired by the actions of the deceased that are described by those who knew them. And of course, these stories are often balanced by examples of how perfectly imperfect we all are. At the graveside service for Jane this past Wednesday, I got to hear many firsthand stories from the people that she had helped directly, including the butcher at Food Lion. How do we continue to say the names of the people that came before us and continue the actions they began to help build the beloved community that God desires, where all can flourish? How do we live out God's presence together? God is present. God was present with Abraham and Sarah. God was present with Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness. God makes a covenant with Abraham regarding Isaac, and God makes a covenant with Hagar regarding Ishmael. And God hears. God hears the cries of Hagar and Ishmael, whether his were vocal or not, and God responds. In today's text, God acted by being with the boy and the boy growing up. And Ishmael responded, living in the wilderness and becoming an expert with the bow. Imagine what our world could look like if every day people everywhere reflected on the actions of those that came before us, who were responding to God's presence in ways that help others. God is present. How will we respond? Amen.